The title of the exhibition, Views from the Field, comes from an interest in thinking about images not from a singular point of view, from the idea of multiple points of view. The field of images that we're immersed in today suggests multiple different ways of seeing and multiple different points of view from which you see. These are objects that were created from 3 separate views of buildings designed by Walter Netsch and then photographed by Orlando Cabanban. These photographs have been processed, colorized, upscaled, and then volumetricized into the objects that you're seeing here. The objects retain the character and the specific point of view of the original image, but are now imagined three-dimensionally as an object that you can move around, producing multiple different views of the image instead of just a singular view.
The gallery show really started, I think, with our interest in the relationship and overlap between physical space on the one hand and representational space on the other. And that's something that is really fundamental to architecture historically. But we think it's foregrounded in a new way, given the character of contemporary visual experience and the way in which we're constantly looking back and forth between small screens and the physical space that we're in. And there's a constant fluctuation between those two. What we were hoping to do with the exhibition is try to produce some of that doubling and fluctuation through layered realism rather than abstraction.
One of the initial interests that started our investigation for the exhibition is the work of Walter Netsch. Walter Netsch is an architect working at SOM in Chicago in mid-century.
He developed a set of ideas that he called field theory, which were about intricate patterns and geometries overlaid on one another, mostly in 2 dimensions, to produce this kind of cellular type of space. And so he would take these patterns and put them on transparencies and overlay them and look at the kinds of cells and volumes that were created. And then a number of his buildings are really intricate aggregations of rooms and volumes in 3 dimensions on the interior. I think there are a number of examples that we looked at of historically ways in which the convex space of physical form and the concave space of pictorial or representational space are intertwined or overlap.
In our research over the past several years, we've been looking at different forms of spatial complexity through imaging. Perspective is a representational technique in architecture that's used to take 3-dimensional space and flatten it. We've been quite interested in that particular technique and how we can use it to think about space differently. Certainly, the way that the project was constructed in virtual space was particularly important and led to a kind of thinking about the object as being constructed in a series of layers. And our interest here was to really build the materials around an idea of blended real and virtual qualities and trying to combine the qualities of those real materials with the materials that you see in the images themselves.
There's really I think a reciprocal relationship between each image that's projected and each object that it's projected onto. So folds and corners and edges in the photograph resulted in folds and edges and corners on the object. And then each face of every object is made up of wood and metal and mirror and cork. The pattern of those inlaid materials is derived again from the contours of the projected image. So there's again an interest in ambiguity and the relationship between the physical and the virtual. So we were working with photography of these spaces from the SOM archive. Black and white photographs are not immersive in the way that color photographs are. We really needed to colorize these black and white photographs in order to work with them. But of course, what they produce is a pure invention. When you put a black and white photo into one of these models or another, you'll get two quite different versions of the same photograph. So you essentially get multiple different photographs and multiple different spaces depicted from those photographs, and they're all kind of equally fictional.
And then the printing process itself, by which the images were applied to the substrate, also accumulated as a series of layers. This is all quite precise, this alignment. I think interesting to us was the way that the frame of the initial photograph and the subsequent images was questioned throughout the development of the exhibition. That kind of framing of the interior is something that becomes questioned as we move through the process of the image object development. The silhouette of the image object that's created, while related to that original frame, invites a kind of a new silhouette into the understanding of the image, and one that's kind of constantly shifting in relation to the image content. These kinds of physical details, I think, are particularly important. We were really trying to orchestrate a kind of circulation, a kind of movement through the gallery and around the objects themselves. So as you move around the object, that frame is constantly shifting.
Views from the Field is a title that I think describes two important things. One is the origin of the photographs and Walter Netsch's ideas. And then the other important aspect, I think, is just the idea of views, plural, that we were really interested in how a single photograph could produce multiple views of the space and multiple understandings of things like authorship, who made it, and what is it materially and spatially. I think the idea that as you move around each of the objects in the show, you get a constantly changing set of multiple images of the original space and the original architecture by Walter Netsch. That's a really important concept in the show for us.
As you move through the projection onto the walls, I think that kind of questioning of the framing of the image and its edges and boundaries is something that we were initially really interested in. The kind of the surfacing of the image suggests constructing materials in a very different way.